Let's have a look at a game from 2011, Wojtaszek versus Simon Williams. The game begins with d4, and then we get e6, the Horowitz Defense. The Horowitz Defense is a way for black to transpose into a main line opening without yet showing his cards, without letting white know what his intentions are. Now this move does invite white to play the French defense, so black needs to be prepared for that. But in this game we see white playing knight to f3, and then Williams responds with f5, entering the Dutch defense, a specialty of his. Now the Dutch defense is usually entered by playing f5 on move 1, but if black does that, he has to be prepared for a number of anti-Dutch moves, including the Staunton gambit with e4. And so black here avoids those kind of moves by playing e6 first and only then playing f5. So this is Williams' preferred way of getting into the Dutch. Now Williams likes the classical variation of the Dutch, and his plan is to put his knight on f6, bishop to e7, castle short, and then the move that characterizes the classical variation is pawn to d6. So let's see how he arrives at this position. White plays g3, very popular move, intending to fianchetto the light squared bishop. The knight comes out, bishop g2, the bishop comes out, white castles, black castles, c4, and now the classical variation d6. So this is the starting position of the classical. And the point of the move d6 is to help support a pawn push to e5. That's one of black's main plans in this position, is to get the pawn to e5 and gain his share of the center. If the pawn makes it to e5, that pawn can sometimes support a pawn coming to f4. And black can often launch a kingside attack. The queen can get to the kingside in a hurry. A typical route is queen to e8 followed by queen to h5. The knight can come into g4 to help attack. The light squared bishop can sometimes go all the way to h3, intending to remove this key defender on g2. So these are some of black's typical ideas in the classical Dutch. Now white has a number of popular moves in this position, and Wojtaszek goes for queen to c2. Okay, now black would love to play knight to c6. That would help support his pawn coming to e5, but you have to time that move just right. You cannot play knight to c6 in this position because white would respond by attacking it with his pawn. Now whenever white pushes his pawn to d5, black would love to respond by pushing past it with pawn to e5. Of course he can't do that if his knight is hanging. Now maybe black can gain a tempo here on the queen and then push his pawn to e5, but that doesn't work because the queen simply attacks the knight. And now while black is dealing with that threat, white would follow up by taking the pawn on e6, and black never gets in his dream position of pushing his pawn to e5. So the move knight to c6 is desirable, but it must be timed correctly. So black actually prepares knight to c6 with the very clever move a5. Now a5 not only gains space on the queen side, but it secures the b4 square for his knight. So now if his knight lands on b4 attacking the white queen, his knight will already be defended, and so the white queen will not gain a tempo on it. So in essence, this flank pawn move actually prepares the centralizing knight to c6 move, which helps support pawn to e5. So it's all about the center. Let's see how white responds. Well, white has his own plans. He wants to push his pawn to e4 and break in the center. His queen on c2 is already supporting that move, so he lends that move further support with knight to c3. Black responds with knight to c6 as planned. And now notice d5 doesn't work here. That's not what white plays because of the move knight to b4. And once the queen moves to safety, then black pushes past the d pawn and gets his ideal pawn formation in the classical Dutch. All right, so d5 was not played. Instead, white tried b3. Okay, now that the knight is on c6, black has sufficient support to push his pawn to e5. All right, at this stage, white decides to trade pawns on e5 and then bring his rook to the only open file on the board, gaining a tempo on the queen. But black's queen was probably headed to e8 anyway to get to the king side. So queen to e8 is the response, and now knight to b5 threatens a nasty fork here on the c7 square now that the queen is no longer defending that square. However, Simon Williams, the Ginger GM, believes in the strength of his position enough to not only sacrifice the c7 pawn, but also the a8 rook. Black starts to launch an attack with queen to h5. Excellent move. Knight takes c7. White takes up the material. f4, supported by that pawn on e5. So black is threatening to crash through here on the king side. White goes ahead and takes the free rook here, and black responds with a beautiful move, bishop to c5. Okay, putting pressure on f2, getting every piece into the attack. The pawn on f2 can be pressured further with moves like knight to g4 or f takes g3, after which the f file would be open and the rook on f8 can get into the attack as well. Okay, the bishop on c8, which often gets developed very late in this classical Dutch, that bishop at any time can come to h3 to try to remove that defending bishop on g2. So let's see, how does white handle this attack and all this pressure that's starting to build up? Well, he doesn't. He cracks right here on move 15. White blunders with rook d5. He puts his rook right where it can be taken by the knight. However, black is not interested in just restoring material equality or getting close to material equality. He is trying to attack. This knight has a more important job than taking the rook. This knight wants to go to g4 to join in on the attack. And that's probably why white put his rook here on d5 to lure that knight away, trying to give some material back. White is also threatening the bishop here on c5. So what does black do about this? Well, he doesn't take the rook directly. Instead, he plays the fork, knight to b4, forking the queen and the rook. So black would love to take the rook on d5 with this knight instead, reserving this knight to come to g4. So he's hoping white will move the queen, black will take the knight, and black will continue his attack, and his bishop will maintain its threatening post on c5. However, white decides to counterattack. He leaves his queen where it is, and he plays rook takes pawn, threatening black's queen. All right, well, black has this all calculated out. He has figured out that he can trade queens here, and he does. He plays knight takes queen, he gives up his own queen, and he follows up with knight takes the rook on h5. So if we stop and take a look at the material here, both sides have all their minor pieces and one rook. White has 7 pawns, black has only 5. So white is still up a little bit of material, but white's rook is under attack on a1. His knight is badly placed on a8, and black still has some pressure with his pieces here. Okay, so we'll see what happens. Well, white has to do something about the attack on his rook. So he has a little choice here. He plays rook b1, and now f takes g3, threatening the pawn on f2. Got a double attack on that pawn. Okay. H takes g3. Knight takes g3 because of the pin on the f2 pawn, and that threatens the pawn on e2 as well. So black has a commanding position. The engine tells me that black is scoring about -1.8 here, but white cracks and just hastens his own demise with a blunder by playing the reasonable looking rook to b2. Okay. White wants to get that rook into play. He attacks the knight. What could be wrong with that? Well, here's the problem with that move. Black makes one more move and white resigns. Black plays bishop to f5. So that move defends the knight, but it also releases an attack on white's knight. Also, notice the rook that was on b1 has left protection of the bishop on c1. So black is also threatening knight takes e2, picking up that bishop. So white cannot save both his bishop and his knight. White's going to go down a piece in the position, and so white resigned. All right, excellent game by the Ginger GM, Simon Williams, showing us exactly how to play the classical Dutch. Thanks for watching.